Welcome back to Sputnik. 49 years ago, on stage in a ballroom in Harlem, Malcolm X was gunned down and killed by 3 black assassins from the rival Nation of Islam. Malcolm was just 39 years old.
He had been a criminal who discovered a rather exotic offshoot of Islam, then turned to mainstream Islam and had just begun to reach out to other poor American communities and to those white students being radicalized by the war in Vietnam.
His actual name was Malcolm Little, but he had the potential to be truly great, and in death he has become so. Today we're looking at the great Malcolm X with one of Britain's foremost black writers, the author and Pan-Africanist Onyeka Nubia. Onyeka, thanks very much for joining us. 49 years ago, almost exactly, Malcolm X was gunned down in rather mysterious circumstances. People went to prison. Indeed, the last of the assassins was only released in 2010. Whilst it's obvious to me, as a white person, that Malcolm could have been a Mandela figure, could have emerged as a Mandela figure, a truly world-class political operator, it is somehow not very safe to declare yourself an admirer of Malcolm X. Whilst Martin Luther King, for example, it's kind of obligatory to pay your respects to him. Why do you think that is? What was it about Malcolm that made him edgy?
I mean, the first thing is that Malcolm is one of the most maligned and misunderstood individuals of the 20th century. And now we move into the 21st century. We are aware that there is a vacancy in terms of such individuals with such honesty, character, and fortitude. And to understand Malcolm, we must contextualize him, because we cannot understand him out of context. No man can be misunderstood without context. Malcolm's father was a member of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This was the Marcus Garvey's organisation. It was the largest organisation of Africans in the diaspora within the history of the 20th or the 21st century. It's never spoken about as such, right? Now, Earl Little was, first of all, a composite organiser and a well-voiced member of that organisation, and was killed probably by the Klan or other members of other organisations, whilst in the pursuit of the gains of that organisation. And whilst it had conservative ideas, its appeal to the mass of African Americans was far more than most Marxist or socialist organisations have been then or since. So Malcolm grew up as effectively a Garveyite. His mother also was a Garveyite, yeah? And when growing up as a Garveyite, he lost his way. He became very confused, disenfranchised with himself, in a way dislocated from himself, and took to a life of crime, as many young people did. And then received an epiphany whilst in prison, and then joined the Nation of Islam. Now, Malcolm was already being trained and moved into that organisation through family connections. Ella Collins had already raised money for Elijah Muhammad many decades before. Wilfred Little had already established a relationship. His brothers Reginald and Filbert were moving towards that movement. And then Malcolm was adopted really as a favoured son and became national spokesperson for the organisation, and really pushed what was essentially a conservative organisation into the mainstream of American politics. And he did this very carefully and clearly by observing what was happening in politics and integrating and offering an alternative perspective. At that point in the 60s, the civil rights movement represented the only voice. And in many ways, though we think of the civil rights movement as rather a conservative affair, in 1955 it was not such. The civil rights movement was considered to be quite radical. As it moved forward into the middle part of the 1950s towards the 1960s, the young became disenfranchised by it. And immediately the Nation of Islam could see it offering an alternative to that particular form of conservatism. So Malcolm and Elijah devised a strategy, and their strategy was to represent themselves as the radicals, to represent themselves as the, inverted commas, violent alternative. Now that violent alternative wasn't marked out by any reality, The Nation of Islam was not engaged in any violent activities against the American government. The Nation of Islam was not involved in any violent killings or terrorist activities against the American government. It was a rhetoric that was offered so that that would be if you like, a different alternative to what was happening in the civil rights movement. It was strategy, it was methodology, it was gamesmanship, if you like. However, with Malcolm, the label stuck, when in fact it had been nothing more than strategy. Because we paint the Nation of Islam or Malcolm as the violent, and the civil rights movement as in was the non-violent. But in fact, it's not quite as simple as that, as I'm sure you may be aware. Robert F. Williams, for example, in the Deacons of Defence, was a military organisation working within the civil rights movement of trained ex-Vietnam veterans, Korean veterans, who were well prepared and willing to conduct violent activities in defence and protection of civil rights workers. The Deacons of Defence worked from the beginning, from the 50s, along with the Montgomery Improvement Association, along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, along with CORE, along with SNCC. And within CORE and within SNCC, they had their own military groups that were working for the defence of freedom riders. None of this is going to be promoted, of course, because the civil rights movement promoted itself as a non-violent organisation. The Nation of Islam, on the other hand, was a very conservative, non-violent organisation in terms of how it operated with the government, etc. But that wasn't an image that was going to be represented either. So what I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, we've got Malcolm as the violent demagogue, and on the other, we've got Martin Luther King as the non-violent, innocent saint. But in fact, in neither case is such idea based on any kind of reality. So this perception that we have of both individuals is actually quite wrong. But in our often polarised perspective, we're looking for a God and then we're looking for a devil. And unfortunately, Malcolm falls into the devil category.
It's a false
it's a false notion.
That's the point. Once upon a time, I asked Fidel Castro, who had been telling me this remarkable story of how Malcolm had guarded him in the Teresa Hotel in Harlem when the Cuban revolutionary leadership had been thrown out of their hotel in Madison Avenue. I asked him, he told me some wonderful stories which we don't have time to go into about Malcolm. And so actually it was triggered by the sight of Bill Clinton out jogging in a Malcolm X baseball cap.
Indeed. Was this 92 or 93 or something like that?
Fidel stopped dead. The CNN was on in the corner. He stopped dead and saw it when he saw the American president with a Malcolm X baseball cap, and he made the point that he never thought that the day would ever come when a US president. So finally I asked him, so what did you think of Malcolm? And Fidel Castro, one of the world's most edgy, dangerous men, said, Malcolm was a very great man, but he was a little dangerous. But he meant it as a compliment.
Of course.
If Malcolm had lived, and of course this is speculation, how different would the situation of black people and the relationships between black people and others in the United States have been?
Well, the important thing is that between the 1955 to about 1974, a whole generation of young people, both black and white, were removed from the American scene. We could start with Edgar Myers, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale. He goes on and on the list of individuals that we removed. Fred Hampton, George Jackson, a whole rafter of individuals working on all levels who were removed. This generation of people would have made not only America, but the whole world a very, 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 very different place. So we have to look at this thing not only as an individual thing, but a question of social engineering. There was a fear that this generation of young people, some as young as 16 or 17, highly politicized, highly intelligent and highly articulate, were very dangerous. So to remove this whole generation of people, which Malcolm X was a part, very young, 39 when he died?
39.
Yes, in his 20s when he's active. This whole generation of people was very dangerous because they would then represent, if you like, the mainstream of ideological thought. And there's always the concern of that sort of politics being in the mainstream, on the fringe, on the edge of society, is acceptable to a certain extent because then you can always demonize them. But if you have these individuals as the mainstream of political thought, and that political thought, that mainstream political thought is radicalized and revolutionized, then that becomes very dangerous to the whole way in which Western society operates, or people may feel the way in which Western society operates. So that's why Malcolm had to be removed. It was when he was internationalizing the situation and internationalizing it so well that he was gunned down. And people say, oh, it was a nation. No. He says, and we must take his word for it, that this is beyond the nation, in his own words. And he's no fool, he's no idiot. He says it's beyond the nation. yes, why he was being removed. When he was meeting Kwame Nkrumah and Secretary in Africa, and then his whistle-stop tour around North Africa, and then...
Ben Bella,
yes, and then,
Nasser,
exactly, yes.
He was internationalizing,
That's right.
and he was crossing class and crossing
Color.
ethnic
That's right.
boundaries inside the United States.
And it was his ability to be able to show relationships between these different struggles that made him particularly dangerous. At a time when America was presenting itself as a democratic voice and face of the world, he was able to show, no, actually, in your back door, you're doing this to 20-odd million people that you've denied rights to for the last 200 or 300 years. This was very, very frightening and very dangerous to a country that's purporting itself as the representation of the divine and perfect upon the face of the earth.
Are you saying that the civil rights movement at the time was unable to see that?
Well, I think, but even when we say that, we must be careful, because Paul Robeson, even in the 50s, understood the power of the United Nations. And even he was petitioning, and this is really the forerunner of the civil rights movement. So what I'm saying is that Malcolm, by the time he left the nation by 62 or 63, he was already thinking how he can work with the civil rights movement. I don't think he saw himself as being separate, but as being part of a more concerted effort, and that made him dangerous. When he was opposed to it, from a strategic perspective or a political perspective, that therefore he could be marginalised. But when he was willing to work with whomever he was willing to work with in order to get the job done, that made him very dangerous. Because then it wasn't ideology that was governing his thought process, but strategy and method. And that's different.
Well, we lost Malcolm, but we got Barack Obama. Onyeka, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Sputnik. Now it's your turn through social media to tell us what you're thinking. Not much time, Gayatri, so give me your best couple.
I found this picture on Twitter which portrays Leopoldo Lopez, the opposition leader, as an economist, professor, medal-winning athlete, and even descendant of Simon Bolivar, versus Nicolas Maduro, the president, as just a bus driver, which is so despicable, to which Clive Griffin responds, Jesus was a carpenter, Prophet Muhammad was a shepherd and a merchant. Follow inspirational leaders, not career politicians.
That's very good. Actually, I knew Nicolas Maduro when he was a bus driver, and it's one of the greatest qualifications that he has, that he was an industrial worker who's now become the President of the Republic.
Indeed. How great could Malcolm X have become? To which Polly Walnuts responds, he could have rivaled Mandela in being a symbol. He was killed because of his rising appeal globally.
If you think about it, he was 39 when he died. He might have lived and been politically active for another 40 years.
Oh, at least, like
maybe
Mandela,
more.
yeah.
Maybe 50 years. And he would have developed, his fame and worldwide reach would have developed.
Yeah.
Everything could have been different. It might have been him in the White House instead of Barack Obama.
Indeed. Well, that's all we've got time for this.
Which, unfortunately, means that's the end of the show.
You know how to reach us on Twitter at @RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook you can find us on Sputnik on Russia Today. Goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.